Welcome everyone. This is our ClimTip webinar. Today we have Imke Hoppe and we will be talking about communicating climate science. Without further ado, Imke, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation to speak in your webinar series. It's my pleasure to discuss with you recent trends in research from communication and media studies. So on the question how tipping points resonate in publics. Why is that important? So one answer is that we should as precise about communication as we are about science itself. And the second answer is that communication is an effort, but it is not only nice to have, it is not only kind of the press release you have to correct. It's not only the interview you have to give, but it is about responsibility of science in society. So it's absolutely more than a fancy website. It's to be understood, to be heard, to be connected with the hope that science can make a difference. Yes, and for that, I'd like to introduce to you three major research fields which are interconnected and relevant to answer this question. The first research field I'd like to introduce to you is to better understand how salient the issue of climate change is in the media. So we try to systematically map how the salience of the issue of climate change is in media coverage worldwide. The second puzzle piece to answer this question is the media use. That means what are the media repertoires people have to access these information? So through which channels, through which media actually do they inform about climate change, or how do they learn about climate change as part of their regular habitualized media use? And the third part, the third research field looks closer into the hearts, minds, hearts, hands of people and asks, what does it do within people's hearts and minds? So how does it change them? How do they perceive this coverage? And does it change anything? Yeah, so the first research field I'd like to introduce to you is the question, how is climate change in general covered by media? So, and one of the major lessons learned, I would say, is that the media coverage is highly event-driven. We see here clear peaks of the events you are very familiar with. So always if there is a COP or an IPCC release, we have very clear peaks of media coverage worldwide. In the latest years, we have also two major events, so to say, which cause a higher salience of the issue, which was extreme weather events over last years, especially in summer, and of course, social movements. We know that social media follow these peaks and that they either follow or lead the peaks from the printed press. Is that a lot of coverage in comparison? Is that much? Is it enough or is that not enough? What does the number say to us? And of course, you have these longitudinal data you just saw, and there you can see in comparison to earlier years that at least in 2023, you have on average 4% higher presence of climate-related news than before, even if we have this kind of multi-crisis, means that, of course, we have wars in our world, we have economic crisis, we had COVID, but even then kind of we see that on average, the amount of climate-related news rises. But I think it's quite hard to see if this number still is an indicator that we talk enough about climate, if the climate coverage or the journalists do a good job, and that's quite of enough. And therefore, it's good to compare that with other issues, for example, with the Corona crisis or with the Ukraine war. And that's from a method point of view, it's sometimes quite hard, as we don't have often the absolute number of articles, posts, programs, so that we can't give you the percentage how much climate, for example, is in relation to coverage on Corona, on the Ukraine. But you can get this absolute number if you look closer into certain programs, for example, the German Tagesschau, so in special formats, in news formats. Then you have, for example, the absolute number of minutes broadcasted, and then you can compare how high is the share of climate in comparison, for example, to Corona or to Ukraine. And in both events, you have a share of, let's say, 40 to 15% of the coverage in the entire program on Ukraine or on Corona, and around about 20% in peak times on climate. So, and how does it relate to tipping points? The coverage of climate tipping points has rapidly increased over the last 20 years. There are very few studies on that, but there are some. And I think even if that are just a few, they prove that tipping point metaphor worked very well for journalists. And it serves for journalists, also for policymakers, as a kind of multi-purpose bridge. Means that it fulfills several news values for journalists to pick that out and to make a headline out of it. Why? What are these news values? One of the news values means a criteria journalists look for to decide, is that a headline or not? Is the degree of damage which is expected? It's also, of course, the negativity, which goes directly into the criteria. Can I report on that or not? And of course, also the impact on so-called elite nations means that Europe is in danger, for example, or other countries of interest for the audiences of media outlets. And as this is so successful, it has been under massive critique from some of the theoretical scholars working in that field on climate communication. And why it's criticized, and I cite Hume here, a geographer, these prospective futures have been grouped together and communicated using Malcolm Gladwell's tipping point metaphor, further nourishing the discourse on global climate catastrophe. Means that this goes directly into the framing of climate change as a catastrophe. And why is that under critique? One of the reasons is that it is widely analyzed in how far the contact to these news leads to further lifestyle changes, to societal relevant activities, or any other effects we wish. And it's kind of really a consensus that the more you communicate, or the more the issue is in the news repertoire of people, it does not lead to corresponding changes in climate action, either on the individual or on the societal level. And I think to better understand why this connection between the information people get and their respective behavior or their knowledge does not change in the same way, gets more or gets easier to understand if we take a closer look in the next two research fields I would like to introduce to you, means in the media usage of these news and the research on directly this media affects and media making sense research. So this is the research field which tries to systematize what we aim for if we communicate. So of course we communicate because it's part of our job, because communication is said to be important, but in related research, we try to structure what we hope communication could aim for. So, and this is a kind of classical separation into three kinds of media effects we are interested in. And the one typical pillar, or the one typical kind of media effects we are interested is in how far communication changes attitudes. Means in how far that leads to a higher problem awareness, for example, to a different risk perception, if there's a higher urgency, for example, and how people relate to it emotionally, if they set a priority on it or if they don't. The second pillar is on knowledge. So of course, in light of democracies, we are interested in enabling people making informed decisions. So of course, we hope that via public discourse, we can help to create a sound knowledge base on climate change. And the second line of effects we are interested in is in how far it changes individual behavior. Not only consumption choices, but also political behavior, voting, campaigning, taking parts in initiatives, and so on. So that is the field. And now comes a theoretical approach, which is very well known, and I'm sure you're familiar with that term, and that is the framing approach. And this approach makes plausible why that should work. So why should it work that a certain message leads to these effects? So why can media frames influence how people, how audiences think about a certain issue? And the basic assumption is that media guides attention to certain aspects of a topic through selection, through emphasis, and also by omission. So to not shed light on certain things, to reduce complexity, and via that to give a kind of interpretative framework. And this kind of interpretative framework makes it much easier for people to classify information in this kind of very, very complex news environment we are all living in, and to suggest a certain view of an issue. This framing model is based on the idea that human processing of cognition works like a kind of network, and these links between nodes of the individual cognition is this kind of networks, and that if you kind of shed light on certain links, people will follow. Means that you kind of have a kind of function like a cognitive highway. So if I say coffee, that you associated maybe with a cup, or particularly very quickly, or if I say apple, then you think of a cake. So that means that you connect very soon a certain term with other terms, other neighboring terms. And the assumption is now that media manage to create particular well-functioning highways in your mind to link certain topics, means to manage that they think them very closely together. So for example, if you emphasize security on energy issues, that people, if they have to vote for a certain politician, they suddenly think, does he guarantee or she guarantee that we have a secure energy in our country? Yeah. Now a very formal definition of what is framing. Framing is to select some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating text, such a way as to promote a problem definition, a causal interpretation, evaluation, and a treatment recommendation. So these four items define an entire frame due to the understanding of Entman. There are many other definitions, of course. So, and if we come back to the climate question and the question of how climate change as a catastrophe can affect people, we of course, so to say, come back to the question, so how does this framing of climate change as a catastrophe affect, for example, attitudes? So Holland gone, Stockholm gone, Berlin gone. How do people react to this kind of headlines? Do they experience the pure horror? Do they freeze in the terror they see there? Or do they start to read the technical report of the IPCC? Or do they start some certain initiatives, kind of behavioral intentions, start to rethink their life, their contribution to consumption, etc., or kind of take part in political activities? One of the oldest studies in the field is this study from Lowe et al. And they studied the movie The Day After Tomorrow. Maybe you are familiar with that. It's a quite old piece, and this movie, The Day After Tomorrow, offered a highly embellishing version of a climate tipping point in which polar ice sheets melt, shutdown of the Gulf Stream, and Europe and much of the US fell into deep freeze. So, and then kind of the logic of these media effect studies is that you ask people before, how do they assess the probability of negative effects of climate change before the movie and afterwards? And the same measure is undertaken with problem awareness. So how aware are they of certain problems and which kind of behavioral intentions do they have? Yes, and the results of one of these earliest studies is that the probability assessment was even lower after the movie. The problem awareness was higher and the behavioral intentions were higher, but only on the short term. So only for kind of exactly the half hour after the movie, but not after 4 weeks after the movie was consumed. So since then, a lot of studies have been undertaken to better understand how this framing works. And one of the major outcomes is that indeed, it's not only a media frame, the catastrophe frame, but there's also a very dominant frame in audience's mind. Means if you ask people what is climate change, they suddenly come up with pictures of devastation, of flooding, of wildfires, etc. So that is indeed something people very soon have in mind if you talk about that. To which effect and what leads that? It promotes the awareness of the problem. That's very, very clear. So people afterwards have this problem as a much higher degree and with a much higher priority. But at the same time, they feel kind of unable to solve this issue as this is very much experienced as overpowering. So, and also connected to a feeling as, oh, we are the ones to blame. And that exactly this feeling kind of provokes defensive reactions in the sense of the cognitive dissonance theory, means that we as humans like to avoid information which are not comfortable with us, which are somehow not homogeneous in our worldviews. And that leads to something that we as communication scholars are really afraid of. That means that that people avoid news, avoid messages as soon as you mention the topic. So that is one of the dangerous things about this framing as a catastrophe. So now I promise to critically discuss the state of art and state of research, which I would like to do now. So one point of critique is, I think, that we have the assumption that a singular stimuli, like one article, one post, have a really kind of a high impact on the change of attitudes or behavior. However, we know that especially routines, practices, behavior is deeply nested in our socialization, means that we are kind of really a long-term framed in a different direction. Then it's kind of unrealistic to assume that directly after a certain post or after a certain article, everything changes for people. So, and that goes especially back to the short-term measurement, means Often it's measured exactly after a movie, after an article, but from media biography research, we know that often the effect, the real effect, turns out to be afterwards, so more on a long-term run. If we ask people what had changed your mind, what made you take part in a political initiative or so on, often people remember one certain article, one certain documentary, one key event which really changed their mind. So another point of critique is that if these stimulus materials used in experimental settings are really good in sound science. Absolutely not in The Day After Tomorrow, what I cited here, as the science base of the movie is much dramaturgized and very much turned into a 90-movie experience. So, and that clearly led to the feeling this is unrealistic, that will not happen. Yeah. A third question I have is, how is the effect if we combine frames? So if we do not only have this catastrophe framing, but we combine it additionally with what can be done. And we have that in this original definition of Ant-Man, which says, okay, problem definition is one element of a frame, but not the entire frame. So we, I think, could stress this solution part and combine it to have a better effect. What is often not analyzed is in how far audiences trust these results. So of course, we have a lot of technical things done to make sure uncertainty is outlined appropriately, etc. But what if we switch perspectives from the viewpoint of lay audiences is key to make something trustworthy. Yeah, and the third debate is kind of that we, I think, shed little light on the question how policymakers perceive the tipping point debate. What arguments and key facts do they really need for the policy arena? Because it is clearly another arena with completely different working conditions than we have in science. Yeah, through future research, what is also a question for you, for the researchers who are doing research on that, because it has consequences for communication. And I would love to discuss it with you in the next minutes. So is that a tipping point more something like a button switch with no return, so that people fear that one day, in 1 minute, or in several years, they will be a button you press and then you have no return? Or is it kind of even a tipping point can be understood more gradual, more as a process which can be foreseen and combated, so that has a high impact on how people evaluate risk and how the fear response is, and also what is seen as effective to combat these? Yeah, second question is, of course, how can we avoid issue fatigue and defense mechanisms? So what is a good entry frame for this message? How can we start with people so that they don't avoid the topic, even if you just say climate or if you just say tipping point? Is it kind of a nature-oriented frame which could help? Is it a value-oriented frame? Yes. Concerning knowledge, it could be interesting to better understand what knowledge people, lay to expert, really need with respect to tipping points. So to clarify it very much, what is something we expect as the knowledge everybody should have? And that comes to a consensus position, which I think should absolutely be communicated in this easy language style, especially on the probability of impacts and the time scale, to make it as easy as possible, of course, without being imprecise. So if the uncertainty degree is too high, it's too high. So we cannot do that. That's completely clear. The last part is concerning, so it's a political action and also the individual action, what is more effective? And we often compare here loss and gain framing, means the question of if we should argue more for the loss we have to be afraid of, or if we want to save things. And especially with respect to more conservative audience, this kind of gain framing could be an option. Yes, last question is, how is the mobilization potential of tipping points for political activism? Because I'm quite sure that we would not be satisfied if people afterwards think, okay, I will change my light bulbs and that's it. But I think in light of these drastic changes you described, much more is needed. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Imke. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your talk. I guess we will be announcing our future webinars, but for today, I feel like it's like my takeaway message is that it is important still to also experiment on this, right? With the evidence that we have in research, with the knowledge of the catastrophe framings and its possible negative consequences.
Yeah.
Try to adapt it and combine it with solution-oriented, right, framings.
Yeah.
Yeah,
absolutely. So thank you so much, Kurt, for your words. Exactly that. So also we as communication scholars, there are many question marks in my mind and of other scholars in that field as well, I think. And the best way is to do empirical research, kind of to test material with real people, to see their responses, to test it with politicians, and to find out how really this in the current situation resonates.